All right, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a UBC Public Humanities Hub Public Scholarship Panel, co-hosted with the University of Victoria's Visual Storytelling and Graphic Art in Genocide and Human Rights Education. I'm Dr. Matt Huckelak with the University of Victoria Libraries, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We all want to begin by acknowledging that UVic is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, on which we are an uninvited guest. We are very grateful to be able to do our work here. And because today's panel is virtual, we invite attendees to acknowledge the territories from which they're joining us today. Today's event is featuring George Beliveau and Christina Cook from the University of British Columbia, and is number 4 in our series. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to our next session on November 2nd with Shell Anderson, who will talk to us about human rights approaches to witnessing and testimony gathering. We hope you can join us this fall for that webinar. And to check out our previous webinars and to view today's webinar once it's posted, please visit the UBC Public Humanities Hub YouTube channel by Googling UBC Public Humanities Hub and YouTube. Today's event introduces us to using research-based theater with post-traumatic stress survivors with Dr. George Beliveau and Christina Cook. The session explores arts-based research. This arts-based project co-developed between returning military veterans, counseling psychologists, and artists, among many other projects both our panelists are involved with. So I'd like to begin by welcoming you two to this session. And I'd like to start off with a question we've started off in all of our sessions, because this does take a very interdisciplinary approach, and that is, how do you two define trauma-informed research? What do those words mean in terms of your intellectual practice?
Thanks so much, Matt, for that welcome and introduction. We're so happy to be here. I think that as a starting point to talking about trauma-informed research, it's important to define trauma. And my discipline is counseling psychology, and that would offer a clinical definition of trauma, which we can all look up in the DSM after this webinar. But I'd really like to emphasize that the definition that I think we bring to trauma in research-based theater is one that's expansive and is defined by individuals and communities and histories. It could be intergenerational. It could look so different depending on the context. And I think this expansive definition is so important in terms of how we begin to create theater-based research with communities like military veterans, and the ways that we draw on theater and the practices that we know from theater, even if we only have a kind of passing familiarity with the theater practices in our local community at the Arts Club or the Belfry in Victoria, or whatever your regional theater is where you are. You know, there's the practices of witnessing, of role play, of rehearsal, of being able to distance yourself from a story by engaging with a character, imagery, symbolism. These are all practices that can help us when we're working with communities and individuals who have trauma experiences in their past, help us share their narratives in ways that are ethical and are care-centered, and allow us to move towards growth.
Thank you.
So building on Christina's exquisite defining of this really large term, I just want to add too that the populations that we have worked with on different research-based theater projects, there's a spectrum, of course, of how people feel about their trauma, how they've actually brought it forward, how much it has influenced their lives. I think we all, if we live long enough, we've all have encountered some kinds, versions of trauma, and the kind of the magnitude of it can surface at different times. So to zoom in on the project that we're talking about, referring to the military veterans, when we began to work with them as a team of artists, mainly theater artists, and there were a number of grad students that came with a theater background that worked on the project. There were some counseling psychology graduate students and professionals in the field, community members who were not necessarily military people, but that just wanted to participate in the project. And then we had our, I would call, key participants, which were military veterans. One of and I want to acknowledge that Marv Westwood, who's a colleague of ours in now emeriti in counseling psychology, was the person that brought a lot of the veterans together and enabled a lot of this project to happen. What was surprising with this project was that in theater, typically we would not ask people to share really traumatic moments, because most of us as theater artists are not equipped to then kind of guide individuals who might be experiencing a fair amount of duress. So we don't shy away from it, but we kind of stop a little bit of the process when people get to too much of an emotional place with personal stories. In this project, it was quite different, because we allowed a little bit more individuals to share their own stories, because it became a healing process, a therapeutic process. And the methodology that was used and that we highlighted in the play, called therapeutic enactment, allowed many of the participants who had already done this kind of work to go partially there. But all that to say that it was a very unique experience for theater folks, because we typically are not equipped to go into that deeper zone. So maybe I'll just pause there.
Absolutely. And I also want to take a step back here to talk about theater as well before trauma, because I recently read yesterday that Martin Amis said, up until the age of 40, you say hello, and after the age of 40, you say goodbye. And I'm well beyond the age of 40 now, and I'm starting to feel those goodbyes more and more in my life. George, you mentioned if you live long enough, you start to experience more and more trauma. And I've been reflecting on the role of theater in culture writ large, in community writ large, right? I mean, going back to the ancient Greeks, there seems to be something, and again, I speak out of complete ignorance here, so I'm hoping you two can elucidate this for me, that theater has something within it that makes community possible, or it does something for community in a way that other art forms might not be able to do. Christina, do you have thoughts on that?
I think that is a really important reflection. And I think the possibilities of theater, so I come to theater from a professional practice, a practice of playwriting, and I combine that with the discipline of psychology. And what I'm amazed at the different experiences that I've had in theater across these different contexts is the way that it brings together multiple art forms, and the ways that theater unites visual and music and dance and writing all in one complete experience together. Liveness, that experience is experienced together. I don't think that theater can exist without community. I think it's dependent on community. And I think that we see throughout time, throughout cultures, these practices that happen in group settings. And we long for those connections that happen in those settings, even if they're happening in the dark with the house lights dimmed, as we're all witnessing the same story on stage. I think that is part of the magic that allows theater to offer something else, something in addition to what these art forms might be able to offer on their own. I mean, of course, costumes just on their own are beautiful works of art. They're incredible, and they can be displayed in many galleries across the world, and they are. But when we combine those with all of the other elements of theater, and it's the same with a play script, the scripts I write are nothing without the community that puts them on and the community that witnesses them. When it's combined together, it creates that magic.
Mhm.
You use the term magic here, and if we tie this back into, you know, your other work,
Yeah.
is magic another word for therapy? Is it another word for community spirit? You know, how do we unpack that word magic here, how you're using it?
Matt, you're cornering me.
I'm sorry, I'm just so interested in what you said.
No, I appreciate it. So I think that my take on magic is that the discipline of psychology would be uncomfortable with that term, and would have some questions about the way that I'm using that term. I think that it exists. I would see the equivalent in psychology existing in the work that counseling psychologists have contributed to connection and empathy in group settings. And I think that we have different terms for the same thing. And this is one of those cases where in theater, we can talk about magic. Artists have no problem talking about magic. Psychologists would rather talk about relationship building and the process that allows change. So I think that that's another meaning that magic can have in psychology, if we're going to translate it across disciplines, the change process and what supports that. And I think everything that we just mentioned and how George just described contact unload, those elements of having the theater artists there, having the counselors there, that created a unique kind of magic or change making process for that particular production, that particular research-based theater project.
And George, what did draw you to, I mean, to me, this is new. I haven't seen this process, this type of project personally. What drew you as an academic, as a person, to this type of work?
Well, thanks for Matt for zooming out to theater again, because our audience who come from public humanities come from different areas, and I think for us to also look at how we see theater. So what drew me to this particular project? I identify now as an academic, though I spent a lot of my life as an artist as well, more as an actor and director in schools and community projects. I think what drew me to this project was that we had a passionate researcher. Our lab is really interdisciplinary in the sense that we only exist in partnership with other colleagues, mainly in the humanities, but also in health and in medicine, who have what we call really exciting data, or participants that have stories that really want to be brought to life through the stage. And we use a term that we bring the humans back out of the research, because sometimes when we do research, they become numbers, they become small quotes. We humanize the research through our theater process. And when Marv Westwood, as I mentioned, approached me about saying, you know, is there a way to stage some of the therapeutic healing and some of the challenges some of the military veterans have gone through, so that a public could engage in richer conversations, I didn't hesitate, because I knew that there was lots of suffering. I had met some veterans, and they're suffering in silence. And this was an opportunity for us to, in the development workshop process, was as rich as whatever we shared with the public. And I just want to make that clear as well, that much of theater, process theater, often happens in a workshop space, and it might not be witnessed by an outside public. And a lot of our projects kind of live sometimes just in that workshop development. Others will then reach a public to hopefully engage in further conversations. So, yeah.
Great. I want to focus for a moment on veterans as well, as part of the co-creators of the process of this work. I was born 2 weeks after the fall of Saigon on a US military base. I grew up with veterans, and at the time, and to this day, the great wound in the American psychological consciousness is Vietnam, right? And here are these very strong, honorable folks who witness things that I still can't conceive. And I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, where 80% of the homeless population are veterans, right? Like, so in this way, America has very much treated its veterans and continue to treat its veterans in a very strange way, which is paradoxical given the amount of energy and well, sort of honor that we put into the military service. So these folks are really living in a paradox, and can't, the people that I know and have met, because they live in a paradox, they're stuck. And I'm wondering what experiences you've had, and the people you've worked with, what makes this, what silent suffering do they experience that your approach to theater helps? So if we could focus on them for a moment, I think that would be helpful for our audience.
Sure. Do you want me to begin, Christina, or would you have a thought right away?
Go for it. I'll pick up.
You'll pick up on it, yeah. Christina joined the project probably a couple years in, and became involved in various capacities with the project as we moved along with it. Now, the US context and the Canadian context for military veterans is quite different, as is the UK one and the Australian one, because we did collaborate with partners in different places, and as we toured the piece, we met veterans and therapists that work with veterans in particular, or who do theater with veterans around the world. So there's a whole area that I was not aware of. I did not come to this project really understanding this whole world. But Matt, as you mentioned, I think it's pretty close. It's one or two degrees separation from a lot of folks, and because unfortunately war has been a common thing in our society. In Canada, or at least in our BC area, a lot of veterans live a little bit in isolation. They come from different communities, and there's less people who serve in the military in Canada. So I can only speak to our project, but many of them, when they came together, there was a camaraderie that took place that was really important for them to come together, and theater does that. It allows us to come together in community. So in many ways, the company became, the theater company also became a little bit of a company for them to feel at ease. And some of the wonderful things of the theater approach that we use as well, it was collecting stories, but it was also very physical. We would do, I come from a theater background where we do theater with just movement. And for the veterans initially to do these activities was they were a little bit self-conscious, but then many of them, that's to move and to use their bodies actually came fairly naturally. So that part for me was a bit of a surprise. The other quick thing I wanted to mention was that although we think about the military coming with trauma or injuries that might have happened while they were in conflict zones, a lot of the traumas might have been triggered by that, but often as we worked through them further, not necessarily therapeutically, but even through stories and through images, it started being that sometimes it was a trauma from their childhood, their adolescence, or the trauma of the hierarchy, of the organizational aspect of the military, ethical things that countries were doing, but not necessarily something they personally witnessed in the field, although those were kind of the gripping stories sometimes to hear veterans talk about a loss or something. But usually there was another version of it. So yeah, so Christina, I don't know if you wanted to add, because we've written about some of this stuff as well, and you've been part of that.
Mm-hmm. I think part of building off of what you're saying, George, part of the pride that you were referring to earlier that's invested in the military, Matt, is that certain assumptions around help seeking and what it looks like to be a soldier, what it looks like to be a veteran, strength and what that looks like. And I think we all have assumptions around seeking care, seeking therapy. They can be gender-based assumptions. They can be assumptions that we should just be able to work them out for ourselves, and assumptions that trauma is something that we should not talk about to not trigger ourselves or trigger anyone else. I think that part of the work of Contact Unload was really also a kind of calling card to the programs that exist here locally for veterans, the specific therapeutic approaches that are tailored to veterans, and allow this idea of the band that existed while people were in service to continue existing. The different therapeutic approaches, like therapeutic enactment, as George mentioned, that is really clearly demonstrated in the play itself. There's an actual staged therapeutic enactment in the script, written into the script of Contact Unload, and that was written with the veterans and the theater artists and the psychologists involved, and performed by all of those folks together. So it's a way of reaching out to veterans in the audience who need support, who might not be sure how to get it, or might be really hesitant to seek it.
Wonderful description of Contact Unload. And since it's come up, let's pause and talk about Contact Unload for a moment. One of the great shows on Netflix right now is Stutz, where Jonah Hill is interviewing his therapist.
Right.
Ostensibly, as a way of sharing with the wider world some of these therapeutic things that have really benefited him as an actor, as a human being in the world. And of course, it's staged too. So I want to say Contact is, it anticipates, it set the stage, so to speak, for other artistic forms that are coming after it. How was this Contact Unload conceived? Was this something that you two came up with together? And how did that process work as a development and as a production?
Well, we have written about this as well. If anyone is really interested, we can let them know more details about it. The birth of it was, I live in the Dunbar, West Point Gray area, and Marv Westwood lives here, and we had several walks together, and part of the birthing of the project and the play happened while we walked and talked. A lot of it happened, the script development was in conjunction with what I call the play development, was as we workshopped the piece with the military veterans, co-writing, co-creating the piece. So we had two other artists that are really important to mention at this stage. Graham Lee, who was a graduate student at that time and is now at University of Manitoba, was scribing, was listening, was on the side and scribing what he was hearing. Also, there was Janice Valdez, who was there also as an artist, listening and really holding the stories for the veterans and some of the civilians that were there. And we had another visual artist, Foster Eastman, who on the side was working with an Indigenous carver as they were creating a tribute pole that we then used in the play. So there is a team of artists, so it was very much of a collective creation. It did center the stories of the veterans, although in theater protection way, we didn't really want veterans necessarily to play their own stories. They became composite stories. We had multiple stories we woven into maybe one character and through or someone else playing someone else's story, although some of the veterans wanted to play their own stories, and I can talk about that later. But in order to make it kind of a little too one-to-one artistically, if it's just kind of soldier one sharing, this is my story, bringing in a few people on, tableau, story two of soldier. So we wove it with Shakespeare. And the main reason we used Shakespeare was that A, the poetic language, but B, also Shakespeare, there's a lot of war stories. So we used snippets of Henry V, of Prince Hal talking about the glory of going to war and what it means to fight for your country. And when you come home, you'll be, celebrated. And so we actually played with that and how the veterans would take that speech apart going, this is what you mean by coming home. This, I'm broken in certain ways and I have to piece myself together. That's what you mean by, so they were challenging kind of Shakespeare's language, and it allowed us a frame to kind of build the play around this kind of heroic language of war. the script changed through various iterations and through as different veterans entered into the project, and as different veterans, their trauma would be sometimes activated. We had to use the term that they were deployed for a better opportunity for another role, so that they could be released from that. And so that happened a fair amount as well.
Christina, given your experience in psychology, what was that process? How would a psychologist approach that particular process of what the veteran is experiencing at that moment? This is before the production, before the stage, but actually working through these roles, deployments, in terms of safety and trauma. And I'm introducing this phrase safety now because it's a big word in our culture right now, right?
Yeah.
Those of us who teach, trigger warning is still a term that everyone understands. A lot of debate around that within the classroom, and safety, safe spaces, brave spaces. And in terms of that theater production, what type of space is being created here as these veterans and creators work together in this process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. And I want to specify that my work with the original productions was in exploring the reaction of audience members and that gathering responses to audiences witnessing contact unload. And I co-collaborated with the team to develop the script as it transformed again into another production called Unload, which we can talk about a little bit more later, why that that transformation occurred over time, over the years, because research-based theater projects really have no end date. They just continue to transform. But I would say that Dr. Marvin Westwood, who we've mentioned, really is one of the founders of therapeutic enactment. And I can hear Marvin in my head really emphasizing the fact that all of the veterans who took part in this project had already participated and gone through a group therapy process, therapeutic enactment. So they had already worked with psychologists. They were becoming mentors, peer mentors in that group setting and helping other veterans. There was a certain point that they had already got to in their experience of processing their work overseas and any kind of childhood trauma that they were experiencing before they joined the creative team of Contact Unload. And I think that is really important to specify. I think it would be really ethically irresponsible to engage with folks who have experienced trauma and create a theater piece with them without creating the space for some kind of therapeutic process to take place. It doesn't have to look like Western therapeutic processes. It doesn't have to look like work with a psychologist or individual or group therapy, but there is a necessary amount of preparation that has to happen before you can go into the rehearsal space or the studio space, and before you can bring folks who have never had experience with theater on stage in front of a public audience. Because eventually Contact Unload was performed in front of public audiences here in the Lower Mainland and across the world. It really toured all across Canada and internationally.
Thank you for explaining that, the ethical steps within the process. I think that's really important for the audience to know. And you also anticipate my next question, and that is, what was the audience reaction? And were there veterans in the audience? And you went through the ethical work with the people on stage. Was there an ethics in terms of the audience now witnessing the material that they're seeing that you've produced on stage?
We were fortunate to have a graduate student who had just arrived to our interdisciplinary program who really wanted to focus on audience, the impact of audiences, and came with a rich background in doing evaluation and assessment, Jenica Nichols. And so Jenica really helped us to kind of elicit meaningful responses from multiple audiences. So that on that side, we've been able to do a little bit of work and move the other projects as well in terms of assessment and evaluation of audiences. For this particular project, the veterans really wanted other veterans and family members to witness the process, and we didn't really call them actors. They were performing stories of self, performing stories of healing. So the audience became witnesses. Let's just use that language. So became this not us and them. It became a together space. I would say that unfortunately we didn't reach the majority of our audience was not necessarily military veterans. It's not necessarily a place where veterans going to the theater is not necessarily always the kind of the sociodynamics that invite folks. So we had to work hard to bring the play to spaces where there might be more veterans. So in fact, we performed in a lot of military armories, which was wonderful. Some of the armories here in Vancouver, we performed at them at events where there were veterans who were going to be there. But that also created a space where the veterans who did attend, and our own veterans, would be in a space that was their own, as opposed to this rented theater on Granville Island or wherever it might be. We did perform also for audiences at the Invictus Games. For those who are not familiar, Prince Harry began what's called the Invictus Games, and it was hosted in Toronto a few years ago. So we were fortunate enough to be invited there. And so there we did draw a number of military veterans, and we did perform it in an armory. Most of our shows in Toronto were in this lovely armory on the towards the east side of downtown. And so that allowed a space where the stories were told in a space where it was veteran friendly. The responses varied. Many of the veterans would come to see the veterans afterwards, after the show, and speak to them. Those of us who were civilian actors in the show, we didn't really draw a large entourage after. They all wanted to talk to the veterans. So it was very powerful. They became advocates, as Christina mentioned. Because they had gone through their own healing process, they could speak to others. We had a lot of referrals for support through, there's a network called the Veterans Transition Network, which helps veterans to be the best person they can be in the healing process. So many folks who came to see the show would say, okay, how can I get help? Not in those words directly. So I think, and a lot of veterans would say, if I can help one veteran with this one show, if I can just help one veteran get out of, the basement or the darkness, it'll all have been worth it. Because as we know, the consequences of sometimes living in that darkness for too long, especially men particularly men will take action and sometimes die by suicide. I want to mention that we had, in the process, we had invited, initially there were women involved in the process. So it was not only men. We did not have women's stories in the original script. We were funded by Movember Canada as a men's health project. So initially it was working with men, but as it grew, we had involved women as well.
I think another just important thing to note about care for the audience is that there were therapists and psychologists present at every performance, and they were pointed out to audience members at the start of the show. I know we mentioned trigger warnings before. We don't really use that term as much in research-based theater, but there is always an introduction before the projects that we perform for public audiences, which lets the audience members know how they can access support if they need to. And in this case, it was through therapists who were actually in the space. People could go and talk to them during the show, out in the lobby or after the show. And there were multiple ways for audience members to provide feedback. I think that part of the care process in a live performance event is allowing audience members to engage in giving feedback or dialoguing after witnessing something. So there was a talk back, which is theater speak for a conversation or a dialogue following the show, as well as ways to provide written feedback and we facilitated several focus groups for months after the performances, where audience members, veterans, and civilians could take part in these focus groups and give us their feedback.
And I do want to focus on the amount of time and care that your team has put into structuring this process, right? Christina, you call it an introduction, right? And I think of a prelude to a Shakespearean play, sort of setting the scene, and then that after play, so to speak. And I want to step out farther for a bit and talk about public humanities or public arts, public theater. Because when most people imagine academics, still in our culture, we still tend to think of that person wearing a robe, reading a book somewhere in a musty place. But you are in the field, so to speak, in the theater, in the community. And I'm wondering what public arts mean to you, and not just personally, but there's also a why question here, because I know a lot of our work depends on, funding, someone supporting us, be that Movember. Thank you, Movember, for sponsoring this wonderful work, to government, to the universities themselves. And I suppose this is two questions. Like, what role do you think public arts have in terms of our lives right now, in 2023? And if you were explaining the why to a public figure holding funding, why is this work so important right now in our culture?
I'll begin. It's a great question, and you also talked about the pre-show and the post-show, and I might get to that as well, because that's like a huge philosophy of the Research-Based Theatre Lab, is to really pay attention to what happens before and what happens after. It's not just what's in the middle, which is the play. When I began on this project, as it started rolling, I think it was, for me, it was a huge aha moment going, okay, as an academic, I had spent a lot of my career up to that point writing pieces in my office, trying to kind of get up the ladder of academia, is knowing that, okay, you need to publish, you need to get these grants, and some of it had lots of meaning and lots of power. This project was on a whole other level. It was really for public, in terms of trying to make a difference. And I think working with Marv's intention at that stage in his career was not necessarily to have more publications, and never really chased that necessarily, but it was really about, can we make a difference? And I was, as a mid-career academic, I felt so fortunate to be part of that. And really, if academic kind of accolades came out of that, or what, it would have been a side benefit. The benefit was to work with humans, with individuals, and working artistically, but the research just doubled, tripled out of that, because we were engaged in something that was very humanitarian, and working with the public. So I trusted that when you're engaged in this kind of work, much will come out of it. So I just wanted to begin with that. So that was one of the driving forces, and I think other people that were involved with it as well. It wasn't a kind of a capitalist approach. It was actually what can we do to change certain behaviors and thinking. Just very briefly on the introduction, and we didn't fully succeed with this piece. We don't always succeed on who kind of sets the space to invite folks in. Because sometimes we would be touring the piece, and we'd had to invite one of the donors to say a few words before, or a political figure to come, and sometimes they knew about the play or the intent of the play, and sometimes they didn't. But we tried to really curate, how did we begin? How did we invite the audience to witness it at the beginning? And that to us is Act 1. And then Act 2 was the play itself, which we spent a lot of time rehearsing. But the final act, or the third act, was really how do we then engage into a discussion with the audience? You know, depending, sometimes we might have had 20 people, but sometimes we had 200 people. So it varied. Sometimes the space was conducive to conversation. But we did try to avoid the just, okay, anyone have any questions? Because then it can, like, sometimes people have questions that can be well-intentioned, but not always well received by the folks on stage, especially with the veterans that might be a little bit activated after the show. So that part, we again tried to curate it in ways that would have been meaningful. And Christina mentioned a few of them. Sometimes it wasn't immediately after, it was focus groups that happened a little bit later on. And yeah, so again, I'll pause there.
Christina?
I think the why of research-based theater and public arts in general, arts-based research in general, to me is what also attracts me to this form. I think it allows a kind of new relationship that traditional academic outputs support other kinds of relationships which are also equally as valid. But this idea of new kind of way of relating to community and those involved in the research, those involved in the art making, and any public that are witnessing the outputs of that, it centers a kind of connection that is unique to arts-based approaches and theater-based approaches. And I would say that it doesn't give a voice, but it centers voices that are sometimes marginalized. And it allows us to hear voices that we don't normally hear from. And I think we see that in this. We think
into the nitty-gritty of how you've structured your projects in terms of the design. So, you know, George, you mentioned having a graduate student be interested in the audience reactions. As you've developed as academics, as theater folk, what have you learned in that process in terms of setting the stage, so to speak, for your research? Like, what makes your research different now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Great. I think what we're learning all the time with the different partners that we work with and the different graduate students and artists that come through and work in the lab. And we've now had the chance to work with kind of local partners, but also learning from our international partners that are doing similar work in different parts around the world. And so it's always fascinating. I would say if I had to pin it down to one thing that I'm learning more and more is that if we're truly doing transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary work, whoever we partner with, so let me just use an existing partner that we've worked probably as long as with the veterans as colleagues in occupational sciences and occupational therapy, who look at data from individuals who work in the healthcare profession who live with a disability. So there's lots of interviews with people who work in healthcare who have share their stories about living with a disability and what the stigma is when you work in healthcare and live with that disability. So with that project, which is so rich, is that the team of occupational therapists and occupational sciences, they want to learn as much about theater and see how theater can be an avenue, a pathway towards further engagement with their field. And the theater artists are involved in it, want to learn as much as we can about what does it mean to be stigmatized? What does it mean to be living with a disability that's visible or not visible, mental or physical? And you know, what is all the pedagogical? We haven't really talked too much about the pedagogical, but what's the pedagogical? But that it's a really coming together, as opposed to the theater people coming, okay, we'll collect your stories and we'll go away and write about it. And how does this sound? A bit of member checking, and then we perform it. We really have learned that if we have actually some of the researchers on the stage if they're comfortable, some of the participants, if the participants are comfortable, then we have this true research-based theater where you have a researcher, artist, and we're all growing. And then the audience, whoever is invited, if it's a more public or private audience, they can see the space is really transformative. You know, that's a big word, I realize, but it is a space where we're coming together with the different disciplines, and the hierarchies are broken down, and we're all in it together.
I think that one of the things that I really appreciate about what George is sharing is that sense that there is space for everyone's vocabulary and language. We were talking about this earlier in the space that we create in research-based theater. So we've definitely been in rooms where even just the question we were exploring earlier, magic versus change process versus relationship building, the different definitions that people bring to the language that they use to talk about their unique processes can really explode in a creative process that involves art and research together. And I think bridging those gaps and allowing everyone in the room to find those connection points. They might be using different words for the same thing, or they may have different concepts altogether that need to be really articulated very carefully in that process. I'd also say that one thing that I've really learned is that when you're engaging in any kind of arts-based research, if you're a researcher out there thinking of doing this kind of work, know that you're not just engaging with an art form like theater, you're engaging with particular artists who have particular aesthetic approaches and particular practices in the discipline. Like the superpower I bring to research-based theater is playwriting. That's the thing I'm gonna bring. Don't ask me to design a wonderful lighting thing for you, or see, I don't even know the language that lighting designers use. I apologize to all lighting designers for that.
Right stuff.
Yeah. Don't ask me about that. So just know that you're not dialoguing with a whole artistic tradition. You're dialoguing with the artist in front of you.
Absolutely. And I think you two have done a beautiful job describing not just the interdisciplinary aspects of your work, but the interartistic aspects of your work. And it takes a community to do this type of work. We only have 10 minutes left, so I do want to invite audience members to ask any questions that you have using the chat function, and we can look at those and propose those to our speakers. But George, you mentioned we haven't really had a chance to talk about pedagogy yet, so I feel like we wouldn't be doing our work if we didn't talk about pedagogy a little bit. So I wanted to give you some space to talk about that. How has this changed either the classroom or how you view your teaching work?
Yeah, and I think, again, very apropos in a humanities hub to talk about pedagogy beyond the classroom is, our community. The classroom is the kind of the world. I guess a lot of the strategies in theater is to show rather than tell, so that the pedagogy that we're trying to invite people in is that here, in order to talk about this directly might be a little bit difficult to talk about a particular topic, but if we show you a scene where there's moments of revealing or crisis, and then we can engage and then talk about because this is where there was a lot of opening up for folks in terms of engagement, was that they could speak to the characters and feel comfortable to talk about that. Whereas if they was speaking about, but sometimes we could see the story of self through the character. And with the, I think that good pedagogy, as in good artistic, the stories are porous enough so audience members could see their stories in multiple versions of the characters, because the characters are nuanced, they're complex. And again, in terms of pedagogy, and I'm sure on this call, there's some wonderful pedagogues that they create an invitation to their teaching where people can see parts of themselves, and therefore it opens up conversations that might not happen otherwise. Though with the, let's just call it the security that there are boundaries. There's this kind of sense of holding the space, so that if we're talking about ethics of care, that we're also not going to open it up too far where we're going to actually create more trauma for individuals involved. And that's setting the boundaries initially to say, okay, these are some of the areas, these are some of the borders that we have to adhere to.
Christina?
Yeah, I think the first pedagogical step is as George is saying, creating that kind of care space for that exchange, but also that sense of when you hear the word theater, a lot of us are going to go into a kind of anxiety space, right? Like you think of public speaking, you think of like, oh my God, am I gonna have to memorize lines? What does that look like? Everybody comes with certain assumptions. Or are we gonna do a Broadway musical at the end? Is that what are we going for Cats? So I think that like the part of what we're trying to create is an open space where people can come in and just let go of some of those assumptions that they might have about what theater is going to expect of them, or what we're going to ask them to do in a process like this. So in the project that George was just mentioning, Alone in the Ring, with healthcare workers who identify as having disabilities, those folks, I remember at the beginning of that process, they said, there is no way that we are going to get on stage and tell these stories. And we just worked for months and over the course of years, and they're still performing those stories. They just performed their show in Iceland at a conference. And that's the researchers who were never on stage before. So creating that space of learning where it feels like there's space for everyone in this research-based theater exploration.
Absolutely. And, traditionally, we see the researcher as this person who's standing away, who's created this clinical space to observe, et cetera, and we know that's very problematic for many reasons. And what you two are describing is a vulnerability, right, where the researcher is a part of the community, but there's still that structure, right? There's still rules, and perhaps that's more of the formal elements of, theater that allows that to happen. Do you see the formal elements playing into the ethical care that you're talking about in your work, George? Like, how do you establish? It seems like those boundaries become a bit more blurred, right? Of revealing your own vulnerability, of being in the group, but also still needing to have that ethical stance so that people are not re-traumatized. That seems like a very new place to be for an ethically informed researcher. And I'm wondering how you balance that.
If Christina and I have done a number of different presentations, often with our colleague Tetsuro Shigematsu, who has been really instrumental in the last several years with the lab. And Tetsuro identifies as an artist, and though has a PhD in using research-based theater, so comes to academia, as Christina does as well, with lots of acumen, despite both being Governor General Award finalists for playwriting. So the lab has been very fortunate to have people at the height of their talents in terms of playwriting and theater making. Tetsuro would say that working in research-based theater as an artist, so I'm kind of flipping your question a little bit, Matt, is that has the constraints of working within the ethics of research have allowed new questions as an artist to ask, like, how am I being ethically responsible to playwriting stories that might be somewhat fictional, but are based on kind of family or autobiography. So Tetsuro has found that the kind of the auspices of the big E ethics has allowed those constraints have actually enabled new things in the playwriting, because often as artists, there's what's called creative constraints, because sometimes okay, well, we only have this amount of budget, we only have this amount of people, we only have this amount of time. You can push against those kind of constraints, and actually wonderful things will arise, because sometimes if it's open field, it becomes a little bit more challenging. For the researchers, in terms of those ethics, I think you're quite right. I think sometimes by knowing that there are so-called rules and things that we want to abide to, both ethically that you've signed the form, that you've said that you would do that, but also your personal ethics that you've discovered that I just don't feel comfortable with that. I didn't check in with that person. If we're going to use this component of it, I really need to check in with that person. I know they said yes on the form, but will they really? So I think with the researchers, they do feel a little bit comfort with that, but it's every project is so, there's new questions that arise that you go, oh, I hadn't really thought about that. How does that play itself out? Sometimes I've found with the lab is that so this is an example of, we're in London, we're performing Contact Unload. We have 4 shows programmed in Canada House, our embassy in London, right off Trafalgar Square. We get this invitation. We have like 18 hours that we're performing for Prince Harry, but the show is 40 minutes. Prince Harry only has 30 minutes to be there, and he'd like to talk at the beginning, at the end. So we have to cut the show down to 20 minutes. We've got 18 hours to do that. So ethically, you start making these decisions going, okay, well, we're not going to be able to consult with Graham, who was the playwright. He is in Prince Edward Island now. Some of the veterans that helped us build the play aren't in the company now. And so all these kind of choices that you make, and you kind of go, okay, what are the best choices to make in this point? So sometimes those guidelines of formal ethics allow us to hang our decisions on.
Christina?
Can we do speed answers to 2 questions in the Q&A? How can undergraduate students get involved with your lab? Google RBT Lab and our website will come up, or it's I don't know if I can type this in the chat, www.rbtlab.ubc.ca. Did that make sense as a web address? Just Google RBT Lab and you'll find us. And there's ways to contact us there. This is a great question. If we could agree on the difference between humanities and social sciences, it's that the humanities are deeply ingratiated with interpretation and most definitely not with fixing things. I agree. Social sciences love a good cure. Veteran stories are replete with suffering and damage. How do you work with interpretation and not find yourself being asked to fix and repair via storytelling? I think that's a really important question. I think that the impulses that often come up in research-based theater processes that I have been involved in is not to fix or repair via storytelling, but to not change. That the story happened this way and we need to tell it this way. And that can be really tricky if we're looking at an ethical care process from trauma. So I think that we can always work with fiction as a means of engaging with some of theater's abilities to create imagery, symbolism, and many different ways of looking at the same story. There's so many ways of telling a story, and we want to make sure that people don't get stuck in the same way of telling any of the stories that that express parts of their experiences.
Great question. We only have a few seconds left, so I want to end with a simple question. What role does catharsis, can I say this word? I can't even make my joke. I can't even say the word catharsis have in our culture. That I was going to end with that, but I totally messed that one up. Thank you both for sharing your knowledge with us today. Oh, there is one more question. Would love to bring teacher candidates to your programs. Will you be updating your calendar? So someone's already Googled RBT.
I love that. You're on it, Stephanie. Yes, we'll be updating the calendar with new performances and sharing and workshops. They all go up there.
Wonderful. Your generosity, not only in sharing your knowledge with us, but also acknowledging all the various people you work with to make this research, to make this theater, to make all of this possible is apparent in your work. Thank you for the work you are doing and will continue to do. And thank you for sharing your time with us this morning. I do want to end by offering you an opportunity to just end with a thought, perhaps something we didn't cover or not. So go ahead, Christina.
The thought that I will take away, that I want to take with me, is just the way that we've been talking about expansive definition. I think that that's something that expansive definitions of trauma, of the work we do, in public humanities of all of this arts-based exploration.
Two quick things. Love this format as it's a conversation which emulates theater, which is about an engagement and what happens, not what I say or what you say, but what happens in between us. Even on Zoom, it's possible. And an acknowledgement, as you mentioned, Matt, to the veterans for that, because we talked about that project. We had invited a veteran to be part of our conversation. The timing didn't work out, though the veterans are dear to my heart and to many of the people that participate in the project. And so I just want to acknowledge all of them that worked with us as well.
And I'm assuming veterans should also feel free to reach out and Google RBT if they're interested in this work.
By all means.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks so much, everyone.